There's a question that modern medicine rarely allows itself to ask honestly, not because of a lack of intelligence on the part of those who practice it, nor because of a lack of compassion for those who suffer, but because of a structural limitation that is inscribed in the very epistemological foundations on which this medicine was built. The question is simple, almost disturbing in its simplicity. Why did this specific human being become ill in this specific way at this specific time in his life? Not in the bacteriological or genetic sense of the question, which medicine knows how to answer with considerable sophistication, but in the deepest sense, in the sense that touches the person's entire existence, and not just the functioning of their organism. Why now? Why here? Why this way? What is this illness trying to say about the life of this being who lives it? Rudolf Steiner spent decades trying to build the necessary conceptual and spiritual tools so that this question could be asked seriously and answered in depth, not as an abstract philosophical curiosity, but as the foundation of a healing practice that recognizes the human being in all the complexity of his nature. Steiner saw in illness something that conventional medicine systematically ignored, a phenomenon that belonged simultaneously to the physical world and the spiritual world, that had its roots in layers of existence that the scalpel cannot reach and that the microscope cannot illuminate, and that could only be truly understood by those who were willing to expand their conception of what a human being is far beyond the limits that scientific materialism had established as the frontiers of reality. Beginning to understand Steiner's thoughts on disease requires starting at the beginning, and the beginning is always the question of what a human being is. Steiner did not accept the answer that scientific materialism gave to this question, according to which the human being would essentially be a biological organism of great complexity, endowed with a nervous system sophisticated enough to produce what we call consciousness and subjectivity, but ultimately reducible to the laws of physics and chemistry that govern all matter. For Steiner, this answer, however impressive the scientific discoveries supporting it, captured only one layer of a much richer and denser reality. The human being was, for him, a being that simultaneously inhabited multiple planes of existence, that was at the same time matter and spirit, time and eternity, earth and cosmos. The human constitution that Steiner described in detail throughout his work recognized four fundamental principles, each with its own laws, its own dynamics, and its specific way of participating in both health and illness. The first was the physical body, the material substrate of incarnated existence, subject to the laws of gravity, decomposition, and mineral chemistry. But already here, Steiner drew attention to something that conventional science often forgot. The physical body of the living human being was not simply a collection of molecules organized in a complex way. It was a physical body permeated and organized by a force that radically distinguished it from any inanimate object, even though both were made up of similar atoms. This organizing force was what Steiner called the etheric body, the second principle of the human constitution. The etheric body, which he also called the vital body or body of formative forces, was the totality of the energies that kept the organism alive, that sustained the form against the constant tendency of the physical world toward disorder and dissolution, that ensured the continual regeneration of cells and the maintenance of the patterns that made that body recognizable as the body of a specific person over decades of molecular change. The etheric body was the reason why a living being was fundamentally different from a stone or a crystal, even though they were all made of matter. It was life itself, not as a metaphor, but as a concrete spiritual reality. The third principle was the astral body, which Steiner identified as the vehicle of the immediate inner life, of emotions, impulses, desires, sensations. It was the astral body that differentiated an animal from a plant. While the plant had a physical and etheric body, the animal added to these the astral body, and with it, the ability to feel, to want, to have internal experiences that went beyond simple growth and reproduction. In the human being, the astral body was that dimension of his existence that lived in the constant flow of emotions, that contracted in fear and expanded in joy, that became inflamed in anger and dissolved in sadness, that pulsated with the rhythms of effective life in a way that the physical body translated into measurable biochemical processes, but that in itself belonged to an order of reality that could not be changed, led to biochemistry. The fourth principle was the self, the immortal spiritual individuality, the eternal core that spanned incarnations and constituted the deepest being of each person. The self was what made the human being capable of perceiving himself as a subject distinct from the world, of reflecting on his own existence, of establishing moral values and working towards them, of consciously wanting to transform himself. Unlike the other three principles, which were shared in varying forms with the animal and plant kingdoms, the self was exclusive to the human being. It was what made each person a unique and unrepeatable being with a spiritual mission that only they could fulfill. With this fourfold constitution in mind, Steiner's understanding of disease begins to take on more precise form. Health was the state in which these four principles were harmoniously related, in which the self could impress its intentions upon the astral body, in which the astral body flowed in an orderly manner through the etheric forces, and in which the etheric body maintained the physical organism in its state of optimum functioning. But this harmony was always dynamic, never static, always the result of an active balance between forces that naturally tended in different directions and that needed to be constantly rebalanced. And when this balance was disturbed in a sufficiently profound and lasting way, when the tensions between the different dimensions of human existence became intense enough to overcome the self-regulating capacity of the organism, the disturbance descended through the planes of existence until it found expression on the densest and most visible level of all, the physical body. The symptom was the arrival point of a process that had begun much earlier and much higher. This image of illness as a process of descent, of something that originates on subtle planes and progressively densifies until it manifests itself in the physical body, is central to the entire Steinerian perspective on illnesses. It means that when the doctor examines the patient and finds the physical symptom, he is seeing the end product of a process that may have begun months or years earlier in layers of existence that do not show up in blood tests or MRI images. It means that treating only the physical symptom, however competent and necessary this treatment may be, is treating the effect without touching the cause. And it means that true prevention is not the one that detects the disease in its earliest physical stages, but the one that learns to perceive the signs on the most subtle planes before they need to densify into the physical body to be noticed. Steiner articulated this dynamic in a particularly illuminating way when he spoke of the role of sleep in human life. During wakefulness, he taught, the self and the astral body are fully active within the physical organism, and their activity on the etheric and physical body is necessarily exhausting. The state of awakened consciousness, with all its intensity of perception, thought, and emotion, consumes vital forces. That's why we get tired. During sleep, the self and the astral body partially withdraw from the organism, which is left to the regenerating forces of the etheric body. It is during this period of relative rest of the astral body that the physical organism can carry out its maintenance, repair, and renewal. And when sleep is insufficient or disturbed, when the astral body remains too active during the night, this regeneration is compromised, and vulnerability to illness increases, not only because the immune system functions less efficiently with sleep deprivation, a fact that conventional medicine already recognizes, but because the etheric forces that sustain the vitality of the organism have not had the opportunity to carry out their reparative work. But Steiner went far beyond the relationship between sleep and health. He described how unresolved tensions at the level of the astral body, emotions that had not found adequate expression, impulses that had been repressed, inner conflicts that had been avoided rather than faced, remained active during the night, disturbing the quality of sleep and preventing complete regeneration. A person who carried with him an unexpressed anger for years, or an unprocessed grief or fear that had been systematically suppressed, carried in the astral body a tension that never completely dissolved, that disturbed sleep even when the person slept enough hours, and that progressively exhausted the etheric forces of the organism. The inevitable result, if this tension was not resolved at its original level, was physical illness. This description anticipates with impressive precision what decades of research in psychoneuroimmunology have demonstrated empirically. The field of psychoneuroimmunology, which emerged in the second half of the 20th century from the pioneering work of Robert Ader and other researchers, has documented the specific biochemical pathways through which chronic emotional states such as stress, anxiety, depression, and social isolation affect the functioning of the immune system, endocrine system, and autonomic nervous system in ways that significantly increase susceptibility to virtually every known disease. What Steiner called the action of the unpurified astral body on the physical organism today has a measurable correlate in inflammatory cytokines, variations in cortisol and adrenaline, changes in the activity of NK cells, and the production of antibodies. What psychoneuroimmunology does not yet capture, and probably will not be able to capture as long as it remains within the confines of the materialist paradigm, is the spiritual and karmic dimension of the process. Because for Steiner, the tensions in the astral body that eventually led to physical illness were not just the product of the emotional history of a person's present life. They were also, and often predominantly, the expression of spiritual patterns that came from much further back, from previous incarnations, from a trajectory of spiritual development that extended through multiple lifetimes, and that, in each incarnation, faced its own challenges and created its own possibilities for growth. The karmic perspective on illness is perhaps the most challenging aspect of Steiner's thought for the contemporary reader, because it demands an openness to the reality of reincarnation that our dominant intellectual culture does not facilitate. But even for those who approach this idea with skepticism, There is inestimable value in the invitation it contains. The invitation to look at each illness not as a random accident that just happened, but as an experience that has a specific place in the developmental trajectory of a being that has existed for much longer and will continue to exist for much longer than the current physical life. This perspective radically transforms the relationship with illness. Rather than the victim of an incomprehensible process, the sick person becomes the protagonist of a learning journey that has its own internal logic, even when that logic is not immediately visible. In his lectures on karma, Steiner presented concrete exemplifications, carefully veiled in their specificity but illuminating in their principles, of how capabilities developed in previous incarnations created specific predispositions for both talents and vulnerabilities in the present incarnation. A soul that had developed great intellectual capacities through intense mental work over several lives could, upon incarnation with this conquered spiritual treasure, bring with it a physical organism with a predisposition to diseases of the nervous system, not as a punishment for intellectual development, but as a natural expression of the one-sidedness that this development had created and that now needed to be rebalanced. The forces that had been intensely invested in the development of cognitive capacities left other dimensions of the being less developed, and this asymmetry found expression in the physical organism. In the same way, Steiner described how acts of genuine generosity, of disinterested sacrifice, of love that went beyond personal interest, carried out in previous incarnations, created dispositions of strength and resilience that manifested themselves in the physical organism of later incarnations as an increased vitality, a greater capacity to overcome illness, a recuperative force that went beyond what the isolated physical constitution could explain. Karma, from this perspective, was not an externally administered system of punishment and reward, but the natural expression of the laws governing spiritual development, which dictated that every force invested in one direction created consequences that needed to be worked through and integrated over time. From this perspective, physical illness in a specific life could be the expression of something that had been initiated in previous incarnations, and that now found the appropriate moment to be resolved. An illness that seemed completely inexplicable in terms of a person's present life, that had no family precedents, that did not correspond to any identifiable emotional or behavioral pattern in the current life, could be understood, according to Steiner, as the expression of a karmic process that had begun much earlier and that now found in certain circumstances of the present life the necessary conditions for its resolution. Disease was, in this sense, not the problem but the solution, the path through which something that had remained unresolved for decades or centuries finally found the possibility of being transformed. This understanding has profound implications for how we deal with suffering. The natural, and in many ways protective, tendency of human beings when faced with pain and illness is to want them to stop as quickly as possible. And there is nothing wrong with that desire. Unnecessary suffering has no spiritual value, and medicine that alleviates pain serves a genuinely compassionate and humanizing function. But Steiner drew attention to the difference between alleviating suffering, which was always an act of mercy, and interrupting a process of transformation before it had the opportunity to accomplish what it had come to accomplish. The wisdom was in distinguishing between the two, in seeking to alleviate suffering without impeding transformation, in treating the body with all the competence available, while keeping open the possibility that that illness was serving a purpose that went beyond the simply physical. Steiner developed throughout his collaborations with doctors, especially in his joint work with Dr. Ita Wegman, a series of principles for a medicine that could simultaneously honor these two aspects of illness, the physical and the spiritual. The anthroposophic medicine that emerged from this work sought to expand conventional therapeutic resources with approaches that acted on the etheric and astral dimensions of the human being. Anthroposophical remedies were prepared according to principles that sought to capture not only the chemical properties of the substances used, but their etheric and astral qualities, worked through specific processes of dilution and dynamization that evoked resonances with the corresponding forces in the human organism. Therapeutic eurythmy created movements that expressed specific spiritual qualities capable of strengthening or rebalancing certain forces in the etheric and astral body. Artistic therapies, including painting, modeling, and music, sought to create a field in which disturbed astral forces could find expression and order without needing the intermediary of the physical symptom. This set of therapeutic resources was based on a principle that was at the same time very simple and very radical. The sick human being was not just a biological organism with a defect to be corrected. He was a spiritual being in the process of development who had found a specific field of work and transformation in a certain illness, and true healing needed to accompany and facilitate this process, not simply suppress its more visible physical effects. The doctor, who understood this, became something more than a technician in human biology. He became a spiritual companion who used his medical knowledge as instruments in the service of a process that transcended biology. Steiner's perspective on children and illness deserves special attention because it reveals some of the most counterintuitive aspects of his thinking. For Steiner, the body that is born is not yet the fully individualized body of that specific spiritual being. It is an inherited body, shaped by the biological heredity of previous generations, which brings with it the marks and tendencies of an entire ancestral lineage. The process by which the child's spiritual individuality gradually takes possession of this inherited body and transforms it into its own instrument is a process that lasts for years, that passes through specific phases, and that childhood illnesses often accompany and facilitate. The so-called childhood diseases, such as measles, chickenpox, and others that characterized childhood before the era of systematic vaccinations, were understood by Steiner as processes that the spiritual individuality of the child used to work on the inherited organism, to imprint its own marks on it and to release certain etheric forces that had been occupied with the construction of the physical organism, and that, after the crisis of the disease, were freed for higher functions such as thought and memory. The high fever characteristic of many of these diseases was, from this perspective, the expression of a spiritual battle in which the individuality struggled to more deeply appropriate its physical instrument. This does not mean, it is important to emphasize clearly, that children should be left without medical care when they become ill, or that vaccines are in themselves a mistake. Steiner's position was much more nuanced than any simplistic interpretation suggests. What he questioned was the tendency to treat every febrile process as a threat to be suppressed as quickly as possible, without considering the possibility that that process had a function that went beyond the simply pathological. Careful and compassionate monitoring of the sick child, combined with an understanding of the process that was taking place, could create much more favorable conditions for complete recovery than immediate and systematic pharmacological intervention in all disease processes. In the same way, Steiner saw adolescence as not just a phase of hormonal and neurological development, however real and important this dimension was. He saw in it the process through which the astral body, which in young children did not yet have full independence in relation to the etheric body, began to emancipate itself and operate with greater autonomy. This emancipation of the astral body was what produced the emotional intensity characteristic of adolescence, the volatility of moods, the heightened vulnerability, the passionate search for identity and meaning. And the health crises that often accompany adolescence, from eating disorders to skin problems, from intense anxiety to depressive states, were often an expression of this turbulence in the relationship between the newly emancipated astral body and the physical organism that was still learning to deal with this new intensity. Treating these crises exclusively with interventions that suppressed physical symptoms or pharmacologically stabilized the emotional state was, for Steiner, risking suppressing a developmental process that had its own logic and its own purpose. The teenager who went through his crisis with genuine human support, with space for the expression of his emotional life through art, movement, and contemplation, with a respectful understanding of the process that was underway, was better able to emerge from it with a stronger individuality, a richer emotional life, and a more conscious relationship with his own being than the one whose symptoms were simply suppressed. There is, in this entire set of teachings, a vision of the human being that is, in essence, deeply optimistic, not in the naive sense of denying suffering or minimizing the difficulty of illnesses, but in the sense of recognizing that even in the most painful experiences of incarnated existence, there are forces that work towards development and not against it. Disease, in this view, is not the enemy of life. He is one of his most demanding conductors, perhaps, but also one of the most effective when he finds a human being willing to listen to what he has to say. This willingness to listen is precisely what the phrase that inspires this text wants to evoke. The body becomes sick when the soul tries to be heard. Not as a statement that all illness is exclusively of psychic or spiritual origin, which would be an unacceptable simplification, but as recognition that the body is the soul's ultimate language, the level at which its messages arrive when all others have been ignored. The fatigue that came before the illness and was ignored. The feeling of emptiness that called for attention but was filled with distraction. The intuition that said something needed to change but was stifled by the force of inertia. The sadness that wasn't cried, the anger that wasn't expressed, the limit that wasn't set. Everything that the soul has tried to communicate through more subtle languages and which has not been heard eventually increases in volume until it can no longer be ignored. The medicine of the future that Steiner envisioned was a medicine that learned to listen on these subtler levels before the message needed to be amplified to the point of physical crisis. A medicine that cultivated not only knowledge of the biological mechanisms of illness, however valuable and necessary that knowledge was, but also the spiritual wisdom necessary to perceive when a human being was straying from his or her deepest truth in ways that would eventually express themselves as illness, A medicine that saw in the patient not just an organism with a defect to be corrected, but a soul with a trajectory, a destiny, a mission, that illness was somehow trying to place back at the center of attention. There is something in this ideal that transcends medicine and that speaks to human existence as a whole. Because if it is true that the body becomes ill when the soul tries to be heard, then the project of preserving health coincides with the more fundamental project of living in accordance with one's own deepest truth, to pay attention to what really matters, not to postpone indefinitely the transformations that life demands, not to systematically ignore the signals that the more subtle planes of existence emit before needing to amplify their message at the level of the physical body. To cultivate a relationship with one's own interiority that is honest enough and courageous enough to realize when something is asking for attention before that request needs to become physical urgency. This is simultaneously the simplest and most difficult to do in a civilization built on the premise that the external matters more than the internal, that speed is more valuable than depth, and that efficiency is preferable to wisdom. But it is precisely in this difficulty that Steiner's relevance lies. At a time when chronic illnesses, autoimmune conditions as mental disorders, and existential exhaustion reach proportions that defy conventional medicine, the perspective that there are dimensions of illness that its instruments cannot reach is no longer an esoteric curiosity. It is an increasingly urgent and impossible to ignore need. Steiner's invitation, reaching us with a relevance that has only increased over time, is the invitation to expand our understanding of what it means to be sick and what it means to be healthy, recognizing that the human being is much more than his physical body, and that taking care of his health means taking care of all dimensions of this vaster being, treating illness not just as a problem to be solved, but as a message to be understood, and to develop the courage to listen to this message with the depth it deserves before the silence of not listening forces the soul to speak louder than we would like. When Steiner described the polarity that structures the human organism, he was revealing something that anatomy knows but rarely interprets spiritually. The superior pole of the human being, centered on the nervous system and the sense organs, is the pole of consciousness, of coldness, of progressive mineralization. It is the pole where the human being is closest to the inorganic world, where vital processes are reduced to the minimum necessary so that perception and thought can occur clearly. The human brain is the most highly differentiated organ in the organism, but also the least capable of regeneration, the closest to death in the biological sense of the term. And it is precisely in this proximity to death that lies its ability to sustain the level of consciousness that distinguishes human beings from all other living beings. The lower pole, centered on metabolism and limbs, is the opposite pole in almost every way. It is the hub of heat, movement, regeneration, life in its most exuberant and least controlled sense. In digestive and metabolic processes, the forces of life operate with an intensity that excludes consciousness. No one is aware of how their liver metabolizes proteins or how their intestines absorb nutrients. There is an organic wisdom at this pole that operates completely outside the reach of intellectual consciousness, but is essential for the maintenance of life. And between these two poles, as mediator and regulator, is the rhythmic system, the heart and lungs, which beat and breathe in rhythms that participate simultaneously in consciousness and the unconscious, which can be controlled voluntarily, but which continue to function when the will withdraws. For Steiner, health was fundamentally a question of balance between these two poles. When the neurosensory pole dominated excessively, when the forces of hardening and mineralization advanced beyond its own domain, the result was sclerotic and degenerative diseases, calcifications, vascular hardening, neurodegenerative diseases that progressively turned into stone, what should remain alive and fluid. When the metabolic pole dominated excessively, when the forces of heat and dissolution advanced beyond its proper control, the result was inflammations, infections, feverish processes, conditions in which vitality became turmoil, in which the heat of life burned what should only heat. This Steinerian polarity finds echoes in contemporary medicine when it talks about balance between inflammatory and anti-inflammatory processes, between sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, between catabolism and anabolism. But Steiner's perspective adds to these physiological balances a spiritual dimension that conventional physiology does not consider. The idea that physical imbalances often reflect deeper spiritual imbalances, that excess intellectual coldness and insufficient human warmth in a person's life can find expression in hardening illnesses, and that excess emotional inflammation can literally express itself in inflammatory illnesses. This is not a simplistic mechanical correspondence like every illness has a specific identifiable emotional cause. It is a deeper structural correspondence in which the patterns of a person's spiritual and emotional life over time create predispositions that express themselves at the level of the physical organism in ways that each person's specific individuality and karmic history make unique and non-generalizable. Two people with superficially similar emotional patterns can fall ill in completely different ways because their spiritual and karmic histories are completely different and create completely different vulnerabilities and fields of work. It is precisely this irreducibility of the individual that makes Steiner's perspective simultaneously so rich and so difficult to systematize. Conventional medicine works based on statistical generalizations, valid for populations, but often inappropriate for the specific individual. Steiner's perspective insisted that each sick human being was unique, that his illness had a meaning that belonged specifically to him and could not be deduced from general categories, and that the work of understanding this meaning required an attention to the individual that went beyond what standardized protocols could provide. The doctor trained according to Steiner's principles was not someone who simply applied a more sophisticated protocol than the conventional one. This was someone who had developed perceptual abilities that allowed him to see beyond the physical symptom and perceive something about the spiritual dynamics of the person before him. This required training that included not only conventional medical knowledge, absolutely necessary for Steiner, but also a personal spiritual practice that developed the faculties of perception necessary to read the signals that the human organism emitted in its etheric and astral dimensions. Steiner described these faculties of supersensitive perception not as mystical gifts reserved for a privileged spiritual elite, but as capabilities that could be systematically developed by anyone dedicated to the path of inner development described in works such as How to Acquire Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. This path was not that of an escape from reality towards altered states of consciousness, but the opposite path, a deepening of consciousness that made it more capable of perceiving what normally went unnoticed, more capable of reading the signals that the etheric and astral planes constantly emitted, but that ordinary, everyday consciousness was not equipped to perceive. The development of these more subtle faculties of perception was, for Steiner, the foundation not only of spiritual medicine, but of a broader transformation of human culture toward what he called the spiritualization of life, a civilization that learned to perceive and respect the spiritual dimensions of human existence would create forms of social organization, education, art, and healing more in line with the real nature of the human being. And this consonance would be expressed in a radically different relationship with illness, in which illness would cease to be the enemy to be defeated and would become the master to be listened to, in which the cure would cease to be the restoration of a previous status quo and would become the arrival at a new state that incorporated learning from the experience of illness. There is something in this vision that touches the heart of what it means to be human. We are beings who learn through experience, including and especially through the most difficult ones. We are beings for whom suffering, when crossed with awareness, can be one of the most direct paths to a depth of wisdom and compassion that comfort rarely provides. And we are incarnated spiritual beings whose physical existence is only the densest layer of a reality that extends into dimensions that the physical eye does not see, but that each one's inner life, when listened to with sufficient attention, can feel and know. The body becomes sick when the soul tries to be heard. And when we turn to that voice, when we find the courage to listen to what it has to say, even when it demands change, even when it points to what we had preferred not to see, something happens that goes beyond the remission of physical symptoms. Something reorients itself in the entire existence. The human being who emerges from an illness, having actually heard what it was trying to communicate, is not the same person who entered it. Not because the disease broke him, but because it deepened him. Because through it, the soul found the space and urgency it needed to make itself heard, and the being who heard it left the experience more whole, more true, closer to what it essentially is than it was before becoming ill.